you ever just stopped and wondered what makes you tick? You know, why you react one way in a situation, but your friend reacts in a totally different way? Well, the answer is all wrapped up in one of the most fascinating ideas in psychology: personality. So let's get into it and explore what makes you, well, you.
All right, here's what we've got on tap. First, we're going to figure out what personality actually is. Then, we'll look at two major ways of thinking about it: the idea of putting people into types versus mapping out their individual traits. After that, we'll take a peek inside the psychologist's toolkit to see how they measure this stuff. And finally, we'll talk about why any of this really matters in our day-to-day lives.
So, let's dive right in. When we talk about personality, what are we really talking about? I mean, it's a word we throw around all the time, but in psychology, it has a very specific and pretty cool meaning.
Think about this for a sec. If you had to describe one of your close friends to somebody who's never met them, what words would you use? You'd probably say things like, oh, they're kind of shy, or really sensitive, or super warm and friendly, right? These are the exact kinds of words we use to try and capture the essence of who a person is.
And that's pretty close to the formal definition. Psychologists see personality as these unique and, importantly, relatively stable qualities. And that word stable is so key here. It's not about how you act in one random moment. It's about the consistent patterns in your behavior, the way you tend to respond to things day in and day out over time. Now, for centuries, people have tried to make sense of these patterns by, well, sorting people into categories. This is what's known in psychology as the type approach, and believe me, it's an idea that goes way back. The basic idea is pretty simple, really. You look at these broad patterns of behavior, and you group people who have similar ones together. It's almost like sorting people into different colored buckets. Are you a blue bucket person or a red bucket person? And this idea has a super long history. I mean, the ancient Greek physician Hippocrates even had a theory about 4 types based on bodily fluids he called humors. Since then, the idea has obviously evolved. You've probably heard of Carl Jung's famous introverts versus extroverts. More recently, you've got researchers identifying type A and type B personalities, and even linking other types like C and D to certain health risks. So here's a classic example. Type A people, they're super motivated, always feel like they're short on time, always in a hurry. They find it really hard to just chill out. And type B? Well, they're pretty much the opposite. More relaxed, patient, and just generally easygoing. It's a really simple but powerful contrast, right? But here's the thing. As neat and tidy as these little boxes are, most psychologists today agree they're just too simple. Real people are way too complex and variable to fit perfectly into one single category. And that realization leads us to a much more nuanced view. So instead of trying to sort people into buckets, the trait approach focuses on identifying the specific ingredients that make up a personality. I mean, is anyone really just an introvert or just a type A? Probably not, right? So the trait approach says, what if personality is more like a recipe? We all have the same basic ingredients, things like shyness or friendliness, we just have them in very different amounts. And those ingredients? Well, those are what psychologists call traits. A trait is just a stable attribute, a quality that makes you different from someone else. You can think of them as the fundamental building blocks of who you are. So it stops being about which box you're in and starts being about where you fall on the spectrum for each of these different blocks. One of the pioneers of this whole idea, a guy named Gordon Allport, came up with this really cool hierarchy. So at the very top, you have cardinal traits. These are so dominant, they basically define a person's entire life. Think of Mahatma Gandhi and nonviolence. Next down, you have central traits. These are the 5 to 10 main words you'd use to describe somebody, like sincere or diligent. And finally, you've got secondary traits, which are more about your preferences, like loving mangoes. Then you have another psychologist, Raymond Cattell, who took a more statistical route. He analyzed how all these different descriptive words tend to cluster together and came up with what he called 16 primary or source traits. He really believed these 16 factors were the fundamental building blocks for everyone's personality. H.J. Eysenck wanted to simplify it even more. He suggested that personality could pretty much be understood along 2 major biologically based dimensions. First, you've got extroversion versus introversion, basically how outgoing or withdrawn you are. And second, there's neuroticism versus emotional stability, which is really about how much control you have over your feelings. Okay, so we've got all these fascinating theories about types and traits, but how do psychologists actually figure this stuff out? How do they go from some abstract idea in a textbook to a practical measurement of a real person?
Well, they have a few key methods in their toolkit. The most common are self-report measures, where you answer direct questions about yourself. Then there are these really interesting things called projective techniques, which use ambiguous images to try and reveal your inner world. And finally, there's good old behavioral analysis, which just involves directly observing how a person acts.
So self-report measures are pretty much what they sound like. You report on yourself. You might see a statement like this and have to rate how much you agree or disagree with it. And by putting together your answers from hundreds of these kinds of statements, a psychologist can build a really detailed personality profile. The challenge, of course, is that, well, people don't always see themselves clearly, or they might not answer honestly. And that's exactly why those other methods are also so important.
Okay, so we've looked at the theories, we've peeked at the tools. But let's zoom out for a second and look at the big picture. Why do we spend so much time and energy trying to understand and measure personality in the first place? Why does any of this actually matter?
Well, at its core, understanding personality helps us interact with people and with ourselves way more effectively. If we can get a sense of someone's personality, we can make a better guess about how they might behave. And that's useful in, well, pretty much everything, from our friendships to our jobs.
And here's another fascinating wrinkle. Our very idea of personality is shaped by our culture. In a lot of Western cultures, the individual is seen as this totally distinct, separate unit. But in many Asian cultures, like the Indian perspective you see here, the self is seen as deeply, deeply interconnected with family and the community.
Which leaves us with one last really big question to chew on. We started by defining personality based on its stability, its consistency. But we also know that people can and do grow and change throughout their lives. So, if our personalities are made of these stable, enduring patterns, how much can we really, truly change? That's definitely something to think about.